Your role is to preserve and pass on the Catholic faith and tradition and teaching in its fullness, the teachings of the apostles. That's really important. I might want to know your opinion on some things, but I'm not really interested in your opinion so much as I am you authentically replicating that teaching in your teaching.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. On today's episode, Acton librarian Dan Huger speaks with the Acton Institute's John Pinheiro, Director of Research, and Michael Miller, Director of the Center for Social Flourishing, about all things conclave. Why are conclaves important? What should people make of the horse race coverage in the media? And what sort of qualities does the Church need most in her next pope? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, and Michael Matheson Miller, Director of the Center for Social Flourishing at the Acton Institute. Today we'll be discussing all things conclave, not the 2024 film, nor the 2016 novel, but the real conclave. It begins today, Wednesday, May 7th, 2025. The 135 cardinal electors begin secret deliberations while locked in the Sistine Chapel. 135 cardinal electors enter, one pope leaves. Each conclave is a momentous occasion in the life of the Roman Catholic Church, and we'll be unpacking just why that is, how it happens, what to make of the horse race coverage in the media, and what the Church in the modern world needs most in her next pope. John, Michael, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Dan.
So, for Protestant listeners, I guess, the best frame of reference for the conclave might be the church lock-in, because that's kind of what's happening. There is, many people in youth groups all over the country will be locked into the church for overnight for sort of fellowship, spiritual upliftment. The cardinals will be getting locked into the Sistine Chapel for fellowship, spiritual upliftment, and of course to make a very momentous decision in electing the next pope. John, what are the mechanics of this for listeners who might not be familiar?
Well, you started with the word lock, and I think that's important. So they are locked in. That's the tradition. That's actually where the word conclave comes from the Latin for with a key. And so I think we want to ask, well, why do we lock them in? And we lock them in to keep things secret. And this isn't secrecy for secrecy's sake, but I like to compare it to the discretion used at the American Constitutional Convention, which was deliberating 6 days a week for months. And the reason you keep things like this secret is so the deliberation can be authentic without people worrying about what might leak out. And so all the cardinals going into the conclave, which now is at 133 and not at 135, but all the voting cardinals going into the conclave are swear to secrecy. The people feeding them swear to secrecy. It used to be, when it was not at the Sistine Chapel, they would lock the windows. So they locked the windows. They used to sleep in there on cots. Now they're going to use Casa Santa Marta, I believe. But that doesn't have enough. It doesn't have enough beds. So my understanding is they had to draw lots to see who gets to sleep elsewhere. But they have to turn in their phones, their Apple Watches, all these kinds of things. So they go in. They'll vote once on the first day. They've been engaged in what are called the general congregations over this past week. Non-voting age cardinals, those cardinals over 80, and the voting age cardinals can all participate in those congregations. And they talk about the future of the church, what the church needs most, what they've liked about the past few years. They don't really talk about people. individual persons in these congregations. Though if you pay attention to the press, especially the Italian press, there's the papabili, those who are thought to be possible for next pope, and then those are thought to be not possible. And then there's the wish list, the progressive Catholics who push against the authentic moral teaching of the church and the magisterial tradition. They have their candidates. The traditionalists who love the Latin liturgy, they have their candidate. Conservative Americans have their candidate. I heard some Filipino nuns on the radio this morning. They were talking about their candidate, who, surprise, surprise, happened to be the Filipino Cardinal, Tagle. And so they go in with their candidates. So there's politicking on the outside, but as Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger said, later Pope Benedict XVI, does the Holy Spirit play a role in the conclave? Yes, mostly just keeping it from being a total failure. But to say that the Holy Spirit chooses the Pope would fly in the face of reason, and we could see plenty of instances where there are men who were chosen who clearly the Holy Spirit would not have chosen.
Yeah, and providence is difficult to trace out, but we certainly hope and pray for the cardinals as they deliberate that they may make a worthy choice. One of the interesting things, and you alluded to this a little bit, is a lot of the press coverage is generated around, speculation as to who the Pope is, if those Filipino nuns will get their way, who will win, who will lose in terms of parties and factions within the church. Is this a helpful and constructive way to think about this, or is this something that actually obscures more of the process than it brings light to?
I think maybe the latter. Maybe it does obscure it. So these conclaves historically have always been full of surprises.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you could say, well, Pope Francis appointed nearly every voting age cardinal who's going to be voting. So they're going to vote for somebody just like Pope Francis. But you have to remember that John Paul II and Benedict XVI appointed the cardinals who then voted for Cardinal Bergoglio, who took the name Francis. And so there's often surprises. There's that old saying, if you enter the conclave as a pope, you leave as a cardinal, right? I think that the best thing our listeners can do, the best thing you can do is not to think in American political categories, not to think in really just us versus them kind of category about when we talk about the papabili and the papacy. So for instance, you'll hear something about this progressive cardinal. Well, was Pope Francis progressive? There was Robert Reinsch today in Law and Liberty, or yesterday in Law and Liberty, was arguing that Pope Francis's legacy as Pope was failure, and he was committed to progressive politics. My only caution there is to say this is also the Pope Francis who compared abortion to hiring a hitman. This is the Pope Francis who called gender ideology the worst form of ideological colonialism. Why? Because he said it blurs the difference between men and women. Now, of course, Pope Francis was not always clear on a number of things. And so there's a critique there in terms of the clarity needed. Benedict XVI was called the Green Pope before Pope Francis was called the Green Pope. The Soviets for a long time looked at Cardinal Wojtyła in Poland and thought, well, he talks about the poor a lot. Yeah. He talks about the workers a lot. Maybe he could kind of be our guy. And of course, they found out not only was he not their guy, he was very problematic and helped bring down the Soviet Union and communism. So you have to be careful what you pray for on the one hand, and you kind of don't know what you're going to get. And the truth is, most of these cardinals don't know each other very well. And some of that has been intentional on the part of Pope Francis, who really hasn't gotten them together over the past 10, 12 years.
And the papacy has a way of changing people's perspectives. Very, very, very... Pope Pius IX, for instance, was someone who, when he was elevated by the to the papacy, was thought of as a liberal and as a reformer. And he really came to be known as the political situation in central Italy developed along the lines that it did, as a sort of arch-conservative pope who, in many ways ended up looking very different as a pope than his prior clerical career would have, one would have judged, one would have expected him to be, and this is something that happens. The office changes people because it's a different sort of office. This is a very unique office in the church. This is an office of universal jurisdiction. It is an office of head of state. It is an office that has a lot more going on than even bishops and cardinals have on their plates, and calls forth different things from the folks who bear it. Michael, what do you make of the sort of horse racing? Do you think this is helpful or unhelpful?
So first, I think you made an important point with Pius IX, right? Because he's the Pope who wrote Mirari Vos, so he was friends with Montalembert and Lacordaire and this whole kind of liberal tradition. I think there's a story, you may know this better than I, but I think there's a story, they were very close friends, Montalembert. When he died, there was a cardinal who celebrated Montalembert, who's a layman, a historian, when he celebrated the funeral, that the Pope actually came and stood at the side and watched because he is attentive to, they were friends, but how strange that is, that the Pope would somehow kind of show up. But anyway, I think it was Pius IX who wrote that, and I think that that's not Pius IX who wrote it. It was Gregory who wrote it.
Yeah, it's Gregory.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, Gregory the 16th Mirari Vos. Yeah, that's right. But you have this kind of all this. But he was the liberal Pope, right? Who's friends with the liberals. I got the Gregory wrong.
He freed political prisoners in Rome when he first, was elevated.
Liberalized
to the
Roman
papacy.
government.
Yep.
Yeah. This was amid the 1848 revolutions.
Yeah, right. And so, sorry, I got the popes wrong. But there's this kind of friendship there, and then there's these. When you get to be the Pope, you end up kind of having to look at things from a very different perspective. And I think that was a good point that you made there. As far as the horse racing, so I don't know. I mean, there's always human beings are involved. I think that John talked about Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, talking about the Holy Spirit. I mean, I don't think John means to overstate that. It's not like the Holy Spirit's not involved. It's not that that there's not prayer taking place. But I think what Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict are trying to get across is it's not a magical thing. It's human beings. God, Jesus Christ established his church. He gave authority to Peter and the apostles, and they're human beings. And we've had human beings running the church since its foundation. And so there's always going to be a horse race. There's always going to be competing visions. There's always going to be these things that are going along. And so in one sense, yes, there's a horse race. But I think John made a really important point that we can tend to think of these things very much in American political terms. I think John's right that you don't want to think about it this way. I mean, even if we think about the way we describe Catholics, right? You've got conservative Catholics, liberal Catholics, progressive Catholics, traditional Catholics, and in one sense, there's something accurate. I mean, it's reflecting something. But in another sense, it's really kind of a category error. Because there's the Catholic teaching, there's Catholic magisterium, and the Pope has a specific responsibility, right, to teach and proclaim the gospel and to teach clarity. And this idea that there's a progressive kind of Catholicism. I mean, there's just Catholicism, and there's clear moral teachings, and that I think so that the problem is, in one sense, yes, there's kind of a horse race, and yes, there's papabile, and yes, there's who's going to get it, and there's coalitions building, and that's just the normal way human beings work out. But in another sense, I think, as John pointed out, to equate it to, say, an American political election or a parliamentary process is also an error. And I think one of the things that this is also the challenge for the cardinals, is that you both need a person who's appropriate for the time, and you need a person who has the interior life, the intellectual gifts, the charisma to solve not only the problems of the time, but to be the vicar of Christ. I mean, it's like no one is ready for this job. right? There's absolutely no one who's ready for this job. So I think, in a sense, the last thing I'll say is, so I think that I do think that as far as looking at the horse race, I think maybe one thing the Cardinals are thinking about are, what do we need now that has to be communicated, not in so much a political way, but what does the church need? And I would say that maybe the two things the church really needs is clarity and governance. And I think this has been a problem of governance, and I'm not an expert in ecclesiastical politics in any way. But, when John Paul II in his last book, I think it's Memory and Identity, he said he kind of analyzed, what is my pontificate? What are the critiques? And he said, one of the critiques in my pontificate was that I wasn't very good at governance. And he said, that's probably right. I could have been better. And it seemed to me that Benedict XVI wasn't really great at governance. He was good at theological clarity, but not governance. And then Francis, really, his governance was quite chaotic from everything I see and heard. He kind of brought an Argentine flavor to the Vatican, and I think that. So I think what is needed right now is governance, rule of law, clarity on financial matters, but also really clarity on teaching. And I think Francis, as John pointed out, was oftentimes incredibly clear about specific issues. But he also, especially in his airplane interviews or off-the-cuff remarks, and even some of his writings, created a lot of confusion and I think a lot of turmoil among Catholics. So I think I would guess that the Cardinals are going to look for someone who could do those two things. Whether that exists in the same person, it's hard to say.
I mean, it reminds me of, imagine a pastor that you know, and it's a pastor who's very holy, and you listen to his sermons and homilies, and you hang on those words, and they're just wonderful at opening up the scripture for you and teaching you the faith and making you think about it in new ways and applying it to your daily life. That might also be the same pastor who's just not really good at balancing the books and raising the necessary funds or giving the ask for the tithe without seeming overbearing. And you don't always find those two together. And so when I pray for the conclave and the choice and for the Spirit, as Ratzinger said, to kind of guide, right? Guide, instruct, but of course not taking over the whole affair. I pray for an Orthodox man and a holy man to be chosen Bishop of Rome. I mean, those are my first two requirements. By Orthodox, I mean beholden to the magisterial teaching of the church, the authoritative moral teaching of the church and doctrinal teaching of the church that Michael was referring to. Way down the list would be, I want a pope who prudentially, on every prudential matter, agrees with me.
Oh yeah, big time.
That's not really high on the list of what I'm praying for.
I actually disagree with John. I want him to agree with me.
You see, this is the
knives are out here in the studio
because this is actually a kind of a joke, but also a problem. I mean, that I think John's getting to is, in one sense, like nobody knows what we're talking about. Like the Cardinals are going to go into conclave. They're going to be locked in, and the knives are out right now. People are criticizing. People are trying to find out, and understandably, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally pick the wrong guy. But I think, in one sense, a lot of people like to comment on it. And here we are having a podcast commenting on it. But we don't know what's going to happen, right? I mean, they're going to go in. They have a lot of information that we don't have, and I think what's I think most interesting is some of the really the technical elements that John wrote a nice piece on, of like how a conclave works, why it works that way, and then what is the Pope supposed to do? What is the role and responsibility of the Pope, and why it matters? I think there's a lot of noise, and partially just because we're having a podcast about it. I mean, you have to say something, so everybody kind of talks. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of speculation, and sometimes people are predicting well, and other times, like who could have predicted, Wojtyła, for example. I think this was in some ways a shock to people, and people didn't exactly know what to expect. I just think it's very, I think as John kind of articulates, we kind of look for our guy or something. But as you pointed out, Dan, oftentimes from the perspective of the Holy Father, what he is seeing and having to deal with and all the information he has, like, we just don't know.
Yeah.
It's above our pay grade.
So one of the things, I mean, all bishops are called to teach clearly and to teach faithfully. This is part of their calling as shepherds. And this is no different from the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome is higher profile in this respect, but in a sense, the duty is the same, actually, for all bishops, is all bishops should be teaching, communicating effectively. But the Pope has some additional powers in his office. And I think of these two as head of state. And one of the things that I think the Pope needs to that I hope to see in the next Pope is an ability to sort of wrangle the Vatican bureaucracy, and particularly in a way to get better financial transparency. This is something that, has sort of been a perennial issue of the last, 20, 30 years.
This is governance, right?
Yeah.
This is governance.
Is you have, sort of periodic financial scandals that should not be happening if the church were effectively governed. And this is something that's very difficult for anybody but the Pope to police because of his temporal power in the Vatican, authority over the Vatican Bank, all of these sorts of things. That's very important. It's also very important with his foreign relations with other countries. We've talked about the China agreement on this program before, which is secret, but we know some things about it. That's something that I hope the next Pope will be able to deal with foreign governments in a more transparent manner, and in a manner that aligns with integrity. And the other thing is his universal jurisdiction. The Pope is able to appoint and remove bishops. And one of the very sad stories of the last 30 years in the life of the church, particularly the last 25 or so, when a lot of this became public, is we have a succession of clerical sexual abuse scandals, literally spanning worldwide, in which many bishops were implicated either in abuse themselves or in facilitating the cover-up of abuse. And this is something that I hope the next Pope will take a very proactive stance for. This is something I've been extremely encouraged at, like, the level of the parish. I have seen priests weep from the pulpit about this scandal, who have urged their congregations, if there's anything amiss, to go to the proper secular authorities to deal with this. I've seen parishes institute all sorts of programs for how to vet volunteers working in the church, how to maintain best practices. I've seen it taken very seriously at a parish level. At the level of oversight of bishops, I think the church could do much, much better on this front. And that's really something that only the Pope, by virtue of his office and his universal jurisdiction, can really affect that change at the level of dealing with bishops who are not taking this seriously.
I don't know if the Pope from Rome can actually do that. So what you're describing is a single human being in Rome, who technically is the temporal monarch of Vatican City State, right? The Holy See. And there's a bishop somewhere in the United States who he's never even heard of, but every 5 years he gets to meet him briefly in a room full of other American bishops. And he somehow can directly control and make sure there's not shenanigans going on in that diocese. That's just very difficult. I mean, think of our own government. Think of a city government, let alone a national government. This has been the real scandal, I think, for me, is, although there have been scandals involving the popes relative to hiding abuse cases, downplaying abuse cases, but this typically has been a scandal of individual bishops who, rather than face the bad press, just hid people, hid abuse, ignored abuse, etc. I mean, that's the big scandal here. And I think it's a much more important scandal and much more scandalous in the truest sense of the word than, say, the financial scandal.
Yeah.
There's been financial scandals in Rome since the 4th century BC.
Yeah.
I hate to be negative. I don't think they're going anywhere. And those are scandals, but there's other more scandalous things, I think, than just the financial scandals. I would point to, when you think about the Pope's more temporal role and what he can do outside the church. I would point you to that recent photograph from the Pope's funeral, where often in one of the alcoves of St. Peter's was President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Trump of the United States, and they're having this chat, and you think, this has been a pope's function since actually cut off in the 1600s, revived in the 1900s. That is being an impartial mediator among countries, trying to bring people together from all over the world, because the Universal Church, the Catholic Church, is everywhere in all these places. That's an important role for the Pope. And I think that's, that points to even why Acton Institute is involved in Rome in the first place, right? This is a place you can bring people together. You can get people to talk to one another who might, in their own country, they're labeling each other, conservative, traddy, progressive, et cetera. And you get them together and they talk about the church and what she needs, and they do it in the awe and splendor of some of these beautiful Roman settings at the pontifical universities or at St. Peter's itself. And that has a wonderful, profound effect.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the things we've talked about. It's a mistake to collapse these into sort of American political categories. But you point out that one of the categories in which we're thinking, and there was a great New York Times graphic on this in the composition of the cardinals, is we have the same or fewer amount of cardinals meeting in the conclave from Europe and from North America than we did the last time we had a conclave. And we have more from all the other continents, more from Oceania, more from Africa, more from Asia. And this is something that, because these pastoral contexts are very different, you still have a lot of Italian cardinals. That's overwhelming, single national constituency that is still the largest. But you have an increasingly global assemblage of cardinals. How should folks think about that? Pope Francis was our first Latin American pope in one sense, but in another sense, both of his parents were Italian nationals. So it's, as little removed from Italy as you can be, with being removed from Italy throughout his entire life, but still fluent in the Italian language, was in many ways a very, very Italian Latin American cardinal. What do we think about, what is it, while it's unhelpful to use those American categories, is it helpful for us to think about African cardinals, Asian cardinals, European cardinals, that sort of diversity in the church? Are those helpful categories?
I think it's helpful to think about what these men as bishops and cardinals from, say, African countries or Latin American countries or the United States, South Asian countries, East Asian countries, it's helpful to know what their experience as the church is, the church in their countries, in terms of religious freedom issues, evangelization, the missions, poverty, how they deal with poverty. Are they put upon by the United Nations or the United States when it comes to aid and development that tries to force them into providing abortion and birth control and a lot of these Western things that the Westerners really like, and yet the Pope Francis called them ideological colonization that just don't, like Cardinal Ambongo said even about fiducia supplicans, it was Western ideological colonization. That is the encyclical that seemed to imply that bishops and priests could bless same-sex couples, which the Vatican then had to clarify. The Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, has historically been Italian for the past 1,300 years because bishops used to be chosen from their own people in their own area. And so to get away from Italian noble families fighting over who gets to be Pope and arguing and promoting their nephews and sons, etc., that's why the College of Cardinals was created about 1,000 years ago in the first place, to get an elective system. There's been times when there were 50 cardinals in the 20th century. There's been time, there's supposed to be 120, but there's 133 that are going to be voting. Yeah. So the rules are rules, except when they're not rules in some sense. They bend around the edges. But Pope Francis has expanded the number of cardinals outside of Europe, but still 40% of the cardinals are from Europe, and only 20% of the world's Catholics are. whereas you might take 40%, or let's say Latin America, 20% of the cardinals are from Latin America, but they have about 40% of the Catholic population in the world. But we want to avoid thinking in what I would say popular terms. So these cardinals aren't representatives of continents. They're also successors of the apostles, like the Pope of Rome was the successor of Peter. So they do have concerns beyond their own countries, but those are the experiences that shape them, of course, particularly the African cardinals. I think a lot of people have said the future of the church is in Africa, in belief, in evangelization, in conversions, you name it. And so I think it's definitely worth looking towards Africa.
Yeah, I would just say, I think John makes an important point that they're not just representatives, right? So Cardinal Bergoglio, Pope Francis was Argentine, but he wasn't the Argentine representative. In fact, he didn't go.
He never went to Argentina as Pope.
And we see John Paul, for example, in one sense, representative of Eastern Europe, of the communist oppression and trying to really. So there is a certain, but he was a Polish Pope and people loved it. But he wasn't just. He was also beloved by everyone all over the world, right? So I think that's just an important point in not thinking that way. But I think with the Africans, it'll be very interesting to see. As John says, I think Africa's growing a vibrant church, right? It's a young church, a lot of vocations. There's, I think, probably positives and negatives for that. Coming from, say, a European, in the European church, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of experience. Yet at the same time, a lot of one of the problems you saw, especially with as a fiducia supplicans, right? This was like a small group of kind of progressive Europeans were pushing something forward, and almost the entire church was like, "Wait a minute, what are you doing?" And especially the Africans, they were very clear. They said this is causing confusion, and I think in some ways what you're seeing now with Africa is that it is in some ways the inheritor of not only the Catholic Church, but of Western tradition. I've talked to a number of African clergy about this. And so, I'm not sure, and I wouldn't bet on, I'm not sure if there's going to be an African a pope. I think it would be great if whoever it would be great to have an African pope. But I do think that, as John also said, that African cardinals do have, at least some of them, clear insight about some of the dangers that have been taking place in Europe and the West, because they can see it from afar. They can see it with some clarity. In one sense, if you're a German and you're just kind of inundated in liberal Christianity over the years, it almost becomes normal to you. Whereas an African cardinal says, like, you have departed from fundamental teachings of Catholic teaching. And I think the other thing that's very interesting is, what you're seeing in Africa and other places is people are making a real commitment to become a Catholic. They, in some places it's just kind of cultural, like it is in the United States or Europe, but in other places it means that you're leaving part of your tradition for the good news of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as the Savior, and you're cutting yourself off from certain things because you have this acceptance of Jesus. Whereas in a lot of European and American context, Latin American context also, it's just kind of soft cultural Catholicism, not very cultural for that matter, very secular, kind of, somebody wrote a piece of this, I looked it up, Cardinal Ratzinger in 1958 actually wrote a very interesting essay called New Pagans in the Church. And he said, if you're standing next to somebody, they may have a baptismal certificate, but they don't think like a Christian. They don't believe like a Christian. And so I think one of the things you're seeing in Africa as a young church is there's actual belief, there's desire for authentic moral and doctrinal teaching. And so that could be a very, I think, positive force, like the youth of the church, inspiration. This is what John Paul brought, especially. I think Ratzinger brought a lot of clarity in teaching, but John Paul brought this sense where, like, Catholicism is real. It requires sacrifice. It has something to say to your life. It means something for your life. And people like John Paul and people behind the Iron Curtain under communist oppression, to go to church meant that you, in a sense, were denying yourself social status because you're going to be if not actively oppressed, you're going to at least be neglected or quietly oppressed by the communist leadership. So I think maybe we need a pope who makes it clear, like, in order to be a Christian in contemporary Western secular life, yes, you may not go to jail, but there's a certain kind of a loss of energy, and so it could be the case that an African could bring that energy, and so we'll see what the cardinals choose.
So another when we're talking about energy, age is also part of this, and we have had for a very, very long time popes in their 70s. Pope John Paul II, when he was
58,
when he was
wasn't he?
elected, 58, but that was in 1978. So we have had exceptionally long-lived popes. Our last three popes have all had very long, very full lives. But Pope Francis was elevated at 76. Pope Benedict XVI was 78.
What about the others? John, you're the historian. Wow.
I don't know all the popes' ages by heart. However, I know.
So there are some in their late 30s if we go far enough back.
So John the 23rd was considered quite old, and that was one of the reasons his election was surprising. But I don't know his age upon election.
Yeah, we've only had a couple. I think 3 popes in their 80s when elected through the history of the church.
The youngest pope, I mean, it was ages ago, might have been 40, but it depends on lifespan and how long folks were living back then, et cetera, and whether the local king was going to come and drag you off somewhere.
We also don't have the birthdays of a lot of popes because just records weren't that great.
I think it's an interesting question, right? Because in some sense, you almost worry. You can almost sense like, well, do we really want a pope who's going to reign for 25 years? Especially, what I think this I don't know. This is me speculating, obviously, but from what I understand, that the cardinals really don't know each other, right? This is pretty much a straightforward position. They just don't know each other. So a lot of them are new. There weren't a lot of meetings with the cardinals, so getting to know each other. I would guess there would be, unless something really clearly comes out of like a clear choice, I would guess I could be completely wrong, but I would sense they're going to want somebody who's a little bit older, so that it's a shorter pontificate. Because if you're not sure who you're actually electing, this is a big deal. And I think so. I would guess that I would guess the youngest is going to be late 60s, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually even somebody older. Just because, especially since after Francis's pontificate, you had in a sense a continuation. You have Vatican II. You have a lot of debates, a lot of fights going on. John Paul II and Pope Benedict really kind of clarified a lot of the things in Vatican II. And there was a sense of, okay, we know where we're going. Francis came back in and, in a sense, reinvigorated a lot of those debates, right? And you see this with liturgy. You saw it with Francis's reaction to the Latin Mass, which was a complete turnaround from what Benedict had done. And John Paul, over time, John Paul and Benedict slowly brought back the Latin Mass. Francis very abruptly shut it down, right? And that's a complex topic, which is a whole other podcast. But nevertheless, that's an issue. Then there was a sense of like progressive 1970s kind of Catholicism is back.
Yeah, kind of allowing discussion of things declared settled by immediate predecessors,
right? So,
like female deacons, for example,
and all these things, kind of like he as he said, Francis said, I want to make a mess, and so this is again just me from the outside thinking, I would not be surprised, especially with the lack of knowledge, that they're going to look for somebody who is going to be maybe a shorter pontificate, who is moderate, prudent, clear on their teaching. I mean, it seems like that would be the kind of reaction after Francis. So I'd be surprised if it's a young person. I don't know what you think, John or Dan, but that's what I think.
So in fairness, when John XII was elected in 955, he was just shy of 19 years old. But his pontificate lasted less than a decade. Before his 28th birthday, his reign ended. So, and we've seen with both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict's a little different because there was a resignation. But they were both long pontificates,
Right.
and Benedict, had he not resigned, would have been a very long pontificate, despite the fact that he was in his late 70s.
It would have almost 20 years, right? He would have been a 20-year
He
pontificate.
just died last year, didn't he?
So I mean, this is part of the challenge is even if you get somebody 70 years old, thanks to modern medical science, we might have a 30-year-long pontificate, conceivably.
So I will so while you have to be under 80 to vote, you don't have to be under 80 or even one of the cardinal electors to be elected pope.
Yes.
Any male
John
Catholic
and I could become
It
pope.
could be. We could.
It's possible.
We could have two popes. Maybe it's happened. Not really, but we've had more than one person claim to be pope.
We
at
had
a time.
3.
Claiming, as Catholics would say, but absolutely. So that's important to keep it. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, just by way of telling you, is 2/3 vote is also required, and
Yes.
that's one of the things that tends towards this expectation by some, like Michael, saying, kind of this pope who comes in is going to be clear, but we don't want to think the way Americans think now in their politics the last 20 years. Our guys get in, we sweep away the other guys. They get in, they sweep away our guys, all new policies.
Right.
That's we don't want to think like that. And if we are thinking like that, we want to pray not to think like that as Catholics.
But that's also not how the church works, right?
And it's just not,
Right.
absolutely.
I mean, like
it's just not how it works.
okay, you could say, oh, well, Benedict put some more pontificum in, and then Francis, what's called Traditionis Custodicus, or however you say it, and the Latin Mass, and that kind of seemed like executive orders. But even the way that Benedict did Summorum Pontificum was very slow. It had been a long process. You'd already had the Ecclesia Dei Commission with John Paul II. You already had a partial indult for the extraordinary form, the Tridentine form, and then he gave a general indult. And then Francis kind of did it very quickly. That I think is a bit more rare, right?
It's rare, and that was there was an evangelical purpose also to
Right.
Pope Benedict doing that. He was trying to bring back Catholics who had left mainly over their liturgical sensibilities, and they were not in communion with the church. But what if you offered them this, and they might come in, right? Society of Pius X, I'm talking about.
And I think, and this is again above my pay grade, but and I do attend occasionally the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, the Latin Mass. I like it; it's great. I do think there were, this is a different topic, but I do think in Francis's defense, I mean, there were some of the traditionalists became so radical. They were actually, creating problems. I won't say a name, but I mean, there's one guy, he wrote a piece called Priests Disobey Your Bishops, like the worst possible advice you could ever give a young priest from a layman, disobey your bishops, after telling them both to make both prudential and moral errors, in service to the Latin Mass. So I think sometimes that some of the hard traditionalists actually created the problems themselves. And so, but it'll be interesting to see how some of those things play out. And I think this goes back to governance. I mean, I think the financial issues are very important. Of course, Dan, you brought up something that's, again, it's a massive topic, but I think there's the sexual abuse problems, that those have to be addressed. I know that they were working on addressing them. They have to be addressed. Part of that, of course, is connected to clear moral teaching. And I think there was a real problem of just clear moral and doctrinal teaching that has to be clarified. And so, I think, I would guess, again, it's probably my hope more than my speculation. I'd say this is my hope, is that after Francis's pontificate, and John and I wrote a piece, an obituary, where we point out, he said a lot of really important things. His critiques of kind of technocracy and the technocratic mindset, I think, are important. His critiques of ideological colonization, his defense of the family, his critique of gender ideology. At the same time, he created a lot of debate, a lot of, in a sense, like confusion. And I think that's been a problem. I mean, I think it's been a problem for the church. I think it's also empowered some people who aren't just like politically liberal, which is a different question, but actually trying to divert or separate, or what's divergent from actual stated, clear, authentic Catholic teaching, I think created a lot of confusion there. And so my hope is that this next Pope, again, focuses on governance, second, and most important, doctrinal and moral clarity, so that I would just say, if you think about Catholics, so in my age, John, we're about the same age, almost since the 1960s, about 1/3 of American Catholics have left the Catholic Church. And from what I understand, about half of them became kind of conservative evangelicals. The rest just kind of assimilated into modern secular society. I went to grammar school and high school, and then undergraduate at Catholic universities. I went to the University of Notre Dame. It's a great place to become a Protestant in those days because I learned very little from my educational experience as a Catholic about the Catholic Church and about Catholic doctrine. And you meet Catholics who know almost nothing about basic Catholic teaching. So I think my hope is that at this point, I think John Paul and Benedict did a lot in bringing clarity. I think Francis brought a lack of clarity, and I don't mean in all things, okay? As I said, I think Francis was super clear on some things, but my hope is that this next Pope really focuses on clear Catholic doctrine, because there's so much confusion. And the last thing I'll say about that is, especially in the time of the internet and social media, if Francis said something that was a little confusing or a little bit ambiguous, you could actually go and read what he actually said, and you're like, oh, that's pretty solid. There were real debates over fiducia supplicans and blessings of
when you weren't reading what was taken and quoted and half quoted and chopped up.
So there were real controversies. Don't get me wrong. Okay,
absolutely.
But there were real controversies. Okay, but a lot of the controversies were actually fake. They were the media, in Catholic and secular, right, taking something and making stuff up. And if you actually read what Francis said, you're like, oh, okay, well, he didn't really actually say that. And then, that takes 2 to 3 weeks or time for you to go. Meanwhile, all these people are confused. And so I guess what I'm hoping from this Pope is that he's incredibly clear, incredibly precise, incredibly concise, and doesn't actually say very much. Because the time of social media and internet, everything the Pope says, people are listening for, and they're trying to take it and spin it. And this is where the facts are. We live in modern American, modern European politics, all over the world. Global politics is often about a spin. We're going to spin what the Pope said, spin what the Pope said. So my hope is that the Pope makes himself very hard to spin.
So that means the gift of being quiet and the gift of, as you say, Michael, speaking very little. And when you do, you can just speak officially. You can speak through official documents. You don't have to give press conferences like you're an American political candidate and you kind of off the cuff, and then you realize, wow, I should have used this word rather than that word, because now I've left things ambiguous. And maybe I've done that on accident. Some are going to think I've done it on purpose. It's better just to be very clear and concise and choose your words carefully. You are the Pope. Your role is to preserve and pass on the Catholic faith and tradition and teaching in its fullness, the teachings of the apostles. That's really important. I might want to know your opinion on some things, but I'm not really interested in your opinion so much as I am you authentically replicating that teaching in your teaching.
So I forget if it was Cardinal Manning or Cardinal Wiseman, but one of the more
I forgot if it was Pius XI or Gregory XIV.
One of the more ultramontane
I forget nothing.
churchmen in England in the 19th century sort of wished that he saw this coming age of mass media, and this print media at the time would elevate the Pope to the point that the Pope could come out with a statement on everything every day, and they could just believe it. And wouldn't this be so wonderful if whenever anything happened in the world, the Pope could just reach out to the faithful and say, oh, here's what you should think about this. And this is, I think about all of this, and Michael's very right about this, is a lot of this confusion was just media-based. A lot of it was just sound bites that are taken out of context. Maybe the countercultural thing to do is for the Pope not to have a Twitter account. Maybe the countercultural thing to do is to speak to the world through your homilies that you give every Mass that you say.
And your Wednesday audience is like, that's what the theology of the body is, Wednesday audience.
Yes. So there are all of these ways, and this is what's interesting is, Pope Francis gave a lot of homilies over his pontificate. They weren't reported on breathlessly like the airplane interviews were. And I think, Michael is sitting here, across from me, and he's got a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is a great part of the legacy of Pope John Paul II was this, and we have the Compendium on the Social Doctrine of the Church. We've talked a lot about a lack of clarity, but in a lot of ways, there's never been more clarity in the church than there is today. Mm-hmm. All of these things are up on the Vatican website. You can read papal encyclicals. You've got catechisms. National bishops' conferences have, informed by the Universal Catechism, created their own catechisms in their national context. All of this is there for folks to take and read if they want it.
And the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, I would add.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an excellent resource.
So, and all of these things are there. They will be there, and those are the things that we should look to, and these are the things that inform the life of the church, including all of the popes. As we're kind of wrapping up here, we've talked a little bit about what our hopes are for the papacy, but we're also sort of we're keen observers of the hierarchy of the church. What do you think the cardinal electors who are meeting today, what do you think their concerns are going to be, and what are the things that you think will animate their discussions and their debate as they decide who the next pope will be?
Well, I mean, they're all different men, for sure. What you can do is go to the Vatican News website and other news agencies. They are reporting what have been said in the general congregations. The Vatican itself is saying, here's what the 10 cardinals spoke today, and here's what they talked about. Some talked about poverty in Africa. Some talked about financial scandals. Some talked about the importance of mission and evangelization. And these are the kinds of things they've been talking about in the general congregations. I recall in 2005, it was then Cardinal Ratzinger's job to prepare the cardinals as they went into their vote about the issues. And he laid them out so clearly and so well, he came out as Pope.
Yeah.
Yes, I think John's, I mean, they're all different. They come from different places. They come from different perspectives. So it's really hard to know. I mean, I will say one thing. I was talking to my family this morning, and I'm just glad I'm not a bishop. I mean, it's a very difficult job. It requires not only intellectual gifts and kind of social, emotional gifts. It really requires a deep interior life to do this well, to proclaim the gospel, and to have confidence and bravery in the face of oftentimes critique and persecution at times. So, I do think there's a lot of issues in the Universal Church because the church is here to proclaim the good news about Jesus Christ, to give hope to man. At the same time, and I think it's really goes back to your point. I mean, there's this certain modern idea. And you said it was either Cardinal Manning or Wiseman who said, is that right? Who you weren't sure, but that's kind of, I think, one of the problems we have right now is we're always looking for a technical solution to our problems, and that the church, if we just get the right pope, everything is going to fall into place, and it's just not going to happen. And I would say, even, I articulate this way a lot, that Jesus is not a technical Messiah. He didn't come to solve all of our problems, right? He came to preach the good news and to free and redeem us and free us from sin. He didn't give us the solution to every single thing in life. He gave us human freedom. He gave us agency and intellect, and he said, go solve it, right? So, the idea in Genesis is complete creation. For Abraham, get up and go. For Jesus, we participate in the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. We make up what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ, as the Bible says. That doesn't mean his sacrifice wasn't perfect, but that we're supposed to participate in his redemption and his redemptive work. And we're also supposed to solve problems, right? And so I think the church, I think this is the other thing, is we have to not make neither an idol of the Pope nor an idol of the church, right? And I think that's what Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was getting to also in this point, is like, look, the Pope is really important, and you need to listen to the Pope, you need to respect the Pope, you need to listen to the Pope, and you need to contemplate what he says. But he's not Jesus Christ. And he is not this perfect oracle that every single thing he says is like perfect. In fact, when Ratzinger was head of Doctrine of the Faith, Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, or dicastery now, he said, you can disagree with the Pope on many fundamental things, okay? But you can't disagree with the Pope on this, and you can't disagree on the Pope that, and you can't disagree on fundamental moral and doctrinal teachings. And I think, at the end, like, there's ultimately, we can't look to the Pope as I said, an idol or as the solution to all of our problems. The problems of man are going to continue. Popes are going to come. Popes are going to go. The Church of Jesus Christ remains, and each of us has the importance to follow him the best we can, to obey the commandments, to pray for the Pope, to pray for one another. And I think so in a sense, like, this is a momentous occasion. There was somebody who wrote an article, and it was a pretty good article, but he said he's worried that this is just too much business as usual. It was an article in Catholic World Report. And he said, I think it was Larry Chapp, and it was a pretty good article, but so I'm critiquing part of it, but I also want to say there was a lot of good insight in it. But one of the things he said was he's a little worried that we're kind of in this is just business as usual, and we have this kind of anti-crisis. There's not really a crisis. And I would say, in some ways, I kind of disagree with that. It is business as usual. At every point in time, there's a crisis in the church. There's always a crisis in the church because there's a crisis of man. There's a crisis of human beings. We're always in crisis. It was momentous. It's momentous now in the face of secularism and new paganism and transhumanism and technology. It was momentous when Pius XII came to become Supreme Pontiff during the middle of World War II. It was pious when it was a momentous and when John Paul II came out of communist Europe. Every moment, in a sense, is momentous, and so it also is business as usual. I mean, it is like, this is the way of the man. This is the way of the church. And so I think one thing I would just say maybe is that these are really important. They're interesting. And in some ways, we don't know what we're talking about because we're not cardinals. We should have an interest. We should pay attention to it. But in another sense, that it's not so momentous that if we could just get the right Pope, finally, we will solve the problems of, Vatican II and the American Church, and everything will fall into place. We're going to have these problems, the next Pope and the next Pope and the next Pope. And they may be different, but they're all going to be variations on a theme. And so I think in one sense, this is where ultimately, as a Catholic, I submit to the Pope, but our faith is in Jesus Christ, and he established his church. And so I think in a sense, we can all kind of be interested in these things, but without overdoing it, that we, in a sense, make it so monumental that we think that whoever is elected is, going to determine fundamentally the fate of the world. That's already been determined by the redemptive work of Jesus Christ.
I think this is a wonderful place to end. The world, the flesh, and the devil remain, but Christ is risen. And
he is risen indeed.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.